She came to beg for her family's lives. She left as the wife of the most feared man in Asia. Zuri Bennett was 23 years old, broke, and out of options when armed men surrounded her mother's restaurant on a Tuesday morning in Chicago. Her brother had stolen from people who didn't negotiate, people who didn't warn twice. The man who stepped out of that black convoy wasn't there to collect money. He was there to collect her. What happened next would strip everything she knew about herself down to bone and rebuild her into something even she couldn't recognize. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning it all collapsed started like every other morning that had been slowly falling apart for the past 8 months. Zuri Bennett was behind the counter at Bennett's Soul Kitchen when the first black SUV rolled past the front window. She noticed it the way she noticed most things that didn't belong. A half-second glance, a small tightening in her chest, then back to the order she was writing down for table 4. Mrs. Calloway wanted her grits without butter again, even though Zuri had tried to explain 3 separate times that the reason the grits tasted like something worth eating was precisely because of the butter. The argument never went anywhere. Neither did most things in Zuri's life lately. The second SUV appeared before she'd finished writing the order. Then the third. They didn't park. They idled along the curb in a line, engines running, tinted windows shut against the October cold, and something about the patience of it, the deliberateness, made Zuri set her notepad down on the counter without realizing she'd done it. She crossed to the window. Outside, the street was quiet, in the particular way that streets got quiet when people noticed something wrong and started making themselves scarce. A man who'd been walking his dog toward the corner had stopped, turned around, was now moving the other direction with more speed than he'd probably used in years. Zuri's mother, Denise, came out from the kitchen with a dish towel over her shoulder and read the look on her daughter's face before she read anything else. "What is it?" "Go back in the kitchen, Mama." "Zuri, please." The word came out steadier than she felt. "Take Aunt Cheryl and go to the walk-in and close the door. Don't open it unless you hear my voice." Denise Bennett had survived a husband who drank himself out of the family before Zuri turned 10, a fire that took out the restaurant's back storage unit, a pandemic that nearly bankrupted them twice, and the specific daily grief of watching her son Marcus make one catastrophic decision after another. She was not a woman who frightened easily, but she looked at her daughter's face, read whatever was written there, and turned back toward the kitchen without another word. That scared Zuri more than the SUVs. The front door opened before she could think about what to do next. They came in without rushing. 4 of them, all in dark clothing, none of them making eye contact with her immediately, which was somehow worse than if they had. They spread out the way men spread out when they'd done this before. 2 to the sides of the room, 1 to the back near the hallway, 1 stopping just inside the door. The one near the door looked at her. He was maybe 30, Korean, with a flat face that gave nothing away and hands that stayed visible at his sides. "Zuri Bennett," he said. Not a question. Her throat was dry. "Yeah, we are here about Marcus Bennett." She'd known it was coming. She'd known since the night 3 weeks ago when Marcus had shown up at her apartment at 2 in the morning with split knuckles and the specific kind of pale that came from fear rather than cold. He'd told her pieces of it, enough that she'd understood the scope without understanding the full depth. He'd gotten in with people who ran money through a private gambling circuit between Los Angeles and Seoul. Korean operation, serious money. Seriously, not the kind of people who accepted payment plans. He'd lost over $2 million of their money in a series of bets he'd been certain were fixed in his favor. They weren't. He'd panicked, tried to run the losses back up, lost more. By the time he'd come to Zuri, he owed somewhere close to $3 million. And the men he owed it to had a very specific process for handling debts that couldn't be repaid in cash. She'd spent 3 weeks trying to figure a way out. There wasn't one. "Where is he?" the man near the door asked. "I don't know." He tilted his head slightly. "That's not a useful answer." "It's the only one I have." She kept her voice flat. Her heart was doing something terrible in her chest, a fast, shallow thudding that she was working hard not to let reach her face or her hands. "Marcus isn't here. He doesn't live here. I haven't seen him in 2 weeks." That was a lie. She'd seen him 4 days ago. He'd come to the restaurant after closing, borrowed $200 from the register because he'd said he needed to get out of the city, And she'd let him take it because she was tired and because some part of her had hoped, that maybe if he ran far enough, this would follow him instead of staying here. That had been stupid. She understood that now with the clarity that only arrived too late to be useful. The man near the door looked at the one by the back hallway. Something passed between them that she couldn't read. Then the one near the door looked back at her. "The debt belongs to the family," he said. "That is how it works. We don't make the rules. The rules already exist." I know. She did know. She'd spent those 3 weeks learning exactly what she was dealing with. "I know how it works, but killing us won't get you your money back. We are not necessarily here to kill anyone, he said, with the particular tone of a man explaining something to a child who was trying his patience. "Then what are you here for?" He didn't answer. Instead, he glanced toward the window, and she followed his gaze in time to see the first 2 SUVs pulling forward, just slightly, and a third vehicle easing up between them. Not another SUV, a car. Dark gray, expensive. The kind of car that didn't have a brand logo that most people would recognize. The man near the door stepped aside. The man who came through it wasn't what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said afterward what exactly she had expected. He was Korean, which she'd anticipated. He was older, mid-40s, she guessed, which she hadn't. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than 3 months of the restaurant's revenue. He wasn't large the way she might have imagined a crime boss to be large. He was of medium build, precise in his movements, and his face was the kind of face that looked like it had spent years deciding exactly how much expression to allow itself and had eventually settled on almost none. He looked at the restaurant with the calm attention of a man assessing something he might be about to purchase. His eyes moved across the framed photos on the walls. Bennett family going back to the 60s, Zuri's grandmother in a church hat, her grandfather behind the same counter in a different decade, and then his eyes settled on Zuri. She did not look away. He seemed to appreciate that, though appreciation might have been too warm a word for whatever passed across his face. "Miss Bennett," he said. His English was accented but clean. "My name is Kang Tae-jin." She'd heard the name. In the research she'd done over the past 3 weeks, the name Kang Tae-jin had appeared in a way that names appeared when people were afraid to say them directly, sideways, in context, surrounded by careful qualifications. He ran the Kang organization. Legitimate business interests in real estate, shipping, and private equity. Less legitimate interests in everything else. The organization operated primarily between Seoul and Los Angeles, with connections that reached into Tokyo, Macau, and parts of Eastern Europe that she hadn't fully been able to map. He'd taken over from his father 15 years ago and had tripled the organization's reach in that time. "I know who you are," she said. "Good. That simplifies things." He moved to the nearest table, the foretop by the window, and pulled out a chair and sat down in it with the ease of a man who sat wherever he chose without waiting for permission. He gestured to the chair across from him. She sat, because what else was she going to do? One of his men appeared silently and set a leather folder on the table between them. Tae-jin didn't open it. He kept his eyes on her face. "Your brother owes my organization $3,200,000, he said. "He does not have this money. He will not have this money. Even if he worked for the remainder of his life in a legitimate profession, he would not accumulate this sum. This is not a disputable fact. It is arithmetic." "I understand," she said. "The standard resolution for this situation is one that would not be pleasant for your family." He paused, not for effect, she thought, but because he was choosing his words with the same precision he seemed to apply to everything. "However, I am not here for the standard resolution." She waited. "I have a proposal," he said. "It will sound unusual. I ask that you hear it completely before responding." Something in the quality of his stillness made her feel that whatever came next was going to be something she couldn't unhear. "Okay. I need a wife." The restaurant was very quiet. Somewhere in the back, the refrigerator unit hummed. "The reasons are several," he continued, in the same tone someone might use to explain a contract clause. "My family in Korea, my mother specifically, has been applying significant pressure regarding my personal situation. I have been a widower for 6 years. My son is 15 and requires a stable household. There are political relationships within certain Korean business communities that are complicated by my current domestic situation. A wife addresses these problems. Zuri sat with this for a moment. And you think I'm that wife? I think you are someone who is out of options, he said. And I am someone who has a specific need. The arrangement would be contractual. You would live in Seoul as my wife in every public respect. You would have resources, financial, educational, whatever you require. Your family's debt would be cleared immediately. Your brother will not be touched. Your mother and her business will not be touched. In return, you fulfill the role for as long as we agree, with terms that would be negotiated in good faith. She looked at the leather folder. That's in there? An outline. The details would be formalized with legal representation. And if I say no? He looked at her with those careful eyes. Then my men conduct the standard resolution, and I return to Seoul this evening. She thought about her mother in the walk-in cooler, standing in the cold with Aunt Cheryl, probably listening to whatever sounds came through the door and trying to interpret them. She thought about Marcus, wherever he was right now, probably still believing that running was going to save him. She thought about the restaurant, the photographs on the walls, her grandmother's hands in those photographs, what it had cost to keep this place running through everything that had tried to kill it. I'm 23, she said. I'm aware. You're 46, he said. Yes. She looked at the table between them. The leather folder, the hands on the other side of it. A man's hands, not young, with a small scar along the outside edge of the right one that curved toward his wrist and disappeared under his cuff. I want to talk to my mother first, she said. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not surprise, more like recalibration. You have 30 minutes, he said. My men will wait outside. She didn't tell her mother everything. She couldn't. Not in 30 minutes, not standing in the walk-in cooler under the fluorescent light with Aunt Cheryl holding Denise's hand, and both of them looking at Zuri with eyes that were reading the shape of the conversation before the words got there. She told her mother that there was a deal, that the debt was going to be erased, that Marcus was going to be safe, that she was going to Korea. Her mother said, "For how long?" And Zuri said, "A while." And her mother looked at her for a long time, the particular look that mothers have when they know they're not getting the whole story and are deciding whether to push. And then Denise Bennett pulled her daughter in and held her with the fierce grip of a woman who had held on through worse. And she said into Zuri's hair, "You don't have to do this." "Yeah, Mama," Zuri said. "I do." Seoul was 45 degrees and raining when she arrived. She'd been given a week to pack her life into 2 suitcases, which had turned out to be both too much and not enough time. Too much time to sit with what she was doing. Not enough time to feel like she'd finished being the person she'd been before. She'd sublet her apartment to a cousin, put her nursing school enrollment on hold. She'd been 18 months into a 4-year program, and said goodbye to the 3 friends close enough to be worth saying goodbye to. None of them had fully understood what she'd told them, which was a loose version of the truth with the criminal architecture removed. She'd seen Marcus once before she left. He'd come to the restaurant looking hollowed out and grateful in a way that made her furious in a manner she didn't have the energy to express. He'd tried to apologize. She'd let him. She hadn't forgiven him, which she thought was probably fine. Forgiveness had a timeline, and right now she was somewhere in the middle of it. Taejin had sent a car. The driver spoke no English, which was either neutral or deliberate. She couldn't tell. They drove through the rain past a city that was enormous and layered and nothing like what she'd assembled from photographs and research, which was always how it was with places. Reality had a texture that images couldn't carry. The Kong family residence was in the Hanam district, which she would later learn was where Seoul's money lived. The building was traditional in its architectural bones, dark wood, curved roof lines, courtyard walls, but extensive in scale, occupying what would have been half a city block in Chicago. It sat behind a wall with a gate that required 3 separate security checks to pass through. The garden inside the gate was immaculate and looked like it had been immaculate for a very long time. Taejin was not there when she arrived. She was shown to a suite of rooms on the East Wing's 2nd floor by a woman named Ms. Park, who was somewhere in her 50s, carried a tablet, and communicated through efficient gestures and a limited but functional English vocabulary. The suite was large and tastefully furnished and completely impersonal, which made sense because it was not her room. It was a room in someone else's house where she was going to live now, and the difference between those things was everything. She unpacked one of the suitcases and then sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the rain on the window and did not cry, which she considered a reasonable achievement. She met Min-jun that evening at dinner. He was 15 but carried himself with the practiced indifference of someone older who decided that indifference was a better armor than anger, even though she could see the anger underneath it clearly enough. He was tall for his age, lean, with his father's precise quality of movement, and a face that was still working out what it wanted to be. He sat across the long dining table from her and looked at her with flat, measuring eyes and said nothing. The dinner was managed by a household staff that moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had been doing their jobs long enough that the people at the table were almost irrelevant to their function. Taejin had arrived an hour before, met Zuri in the main receiving room, shaken her hand, and asked if her accommodations were acceptable. She'd said yes. He'd said good. They'd gone to dinner. Min-jun stared at her across the table. She stared back, not aggressively, just evenly, because she'd grown up with Marcus, and she knew that teenagers communicated in staring contests, and if you flinched first, you'd lost something you'd have to spend months getting back. "You don't speak Korean," he said finally, in English that was nearly accent-free. "Not yet," she said. "My father's last assistant didn't speak Korean either, and she lasted 4 months." Taejin said something to him in Korean, short, quiet, the tone of a man who wasn't going to repeat himself. Min-jun looked at his food. "I'm not an assistant," Zuri said to the top of Min-jun's head. He looked up. "I'm aware of what I am," she continued. "I'm aware of what this is. I'm not here to pretend otherwise. But if you're going to spend every dinner trying to run me off, I should probably tell you up front that I'm a lot harder to discourage than I look." Min-jun said nothing, but something shifted in his face, a small recalibration, similar to what she'd seen in his father's face back in the restaurant, and she wondered if that was a Kang family trait or just what happened when people encountered a response they hadn't predicted. Taejin was watching her from the head of the table with the same unreadable attention he'd given her from the moment they'd met. She picked up her chopsticks and focused on her food and let the silence be what it was. The first formal public event came 12 days after she arrived. A business dinner at a restaurant in Gangnam that required 4 hours of preparation because the preparation wasn't really about the dinner. It was about every eye in that room and what those eyes were going to think and what those thoughts were going to cost the Kang organization in alliances and affiliations and the particular currency of face that Seoul's elite ran on. The woman Taejin sent to help her prepare was named Kim Ji-yeon, and she was 32 and had the energy of someone who'd been hired to solve a very specific problem and intended to solve it well. She brought 3 dresses. 2 of them were beautiful in the particular way that expensive clothes were beautiful, which was to say they were designed to make the woman wearing them invisible inside the clothes. The third was different, deep burgundy, simple cut, nothing that competed with the person inside it. Zuri chose the burgundy. Ji-yeon smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. The dinner was 22 people at a round table in a private room, and Zuri understood within the first 10 minutes that she was being assessed, and that everyone doing the assessing had already made their provisional conclusions, and was now either looking for evidence to confirm them or looking for reasons to revise them downward. The women at the table were the more precise instruments of this process. They smiled with their lips and said polished things in Korean that Ji-yeon, seated slightly behind Zuri's right shoulder, translated in low murmurs. The wife of Park Sung-ho. Park Sung-ho, who ran, Zuri had been briefed, a shipping conglomerate that was the Kang organization's largest legitimate business partner, leaned toward Zuri with a smile that didn't involve her eyes and said, through Ji-yeon's translation, "How interesting that Taejin has chosen such an exotic arrangement." The word exotic arrived in Zuri's ear with its full weight. She let it sit there for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to make sure everyone at the table who was watching, and several of them were watching, understood she'd heard it. Then she smiled, warm and unhurried, and said, "He always did have impeccable taste." The woman blinked. Taejin, seated to Zuri's left, did not look at her, but she felt something change in the quality of his attention, the way you felt a temperature shift. Ji-yeon translated Zuri's response, and the table shifted fractionally, the way tables shifted when someone had come in prepared for a specific kind of person and had gotten a different one instead. It wasn't a victory, it was one small data point in a very long campaign. But Zuri had grown up working her mother's restaurant, dealing with difficult customers, managing the specific art of being the youngest and the black woman in every room where those things were held against you. She knew how to take a hit and stand in it and smile until the person who threw it started wondering if they'd landed it right. The weeks that followed were exhausting in a way that was different from any exhaustion she'd felt before. Not physical. She'd done 16-hour shifts at the restaurant and come back the next morning. This was a different kind of tired, the kind that came from never being completely off. Every interaction was a calculation. Every meal was a performance. Every time she walked into a room, she had to assemble herself like someone putting on armor before a door opened. She studied Korean with a tutor who came every morning at 7. She made herself learn it the way she'd made herself learn things her whole life, with a fury that was mostly directed at the situation but expressed itself as effort. She was not naturally gifted at languages, which meant she had to work twice as hard and review twice as often and embarrass herself twice as frequently in the early weeks when her pronunciation was actively terrible. Minjun witnessed one of these tutoring sessions once, passing through the sitting room while she was struggling with the pitch patterns of a phrase that she kept mangling. He stopped in the doorway. She braced for something sharp. Instead, he said flatly, "You're making your tongue too tense. Let it sit forward." She tried it. It was better. He walked away without waiting for thanks. She filed it away the way she filed everything, not as warmth, not yet, but as data. The kind of small signal that you didn't make too much of immediately, but didn't ignore either. It was in the 6th week that she and Tae-jin had their first real conversation. Real in the sense that it wasn't transactional. Wasn't about the schedule or the next event or the logistics of her enrollment in a pre-med program at Yonsei University, which he had arranged with the same quiet efficiency he applied to everything. Real in the sense that it was late, nearly midnight, and she'd come down to the kitchen because she couldn't sleep, which happened often in those early weeks, and found him already there, still in his dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, sitting at the kitchen island with a glass of something amber and a file folder that he closed when she came in. They looked at each other. She said, "I'm just getting water." He said, "Sit down if you want." She sat. The kitchen was quieter than the rest of the house in a way that felt different from the rest of the house's quiet, less managed. She poured her water and held the glass and looked at the counter, and then, because she was tired and because 3 in the morning was a different country than the rest of the day with its own rules, she said, "Why did you pick me specifically?" He turned the glass in his hands once. "What do you mean?" "You needed a wife. There are presumably other women in the world. Why me?" He was quiet for a moment, not evading. She'd come to recognize the difference between his evasions and his pauses, which was something she hadn't expected to learn as quickly as she had. "I investigated your family when the debt became relevant," he said. "I read the report on you." "And? You had been working since you were 14. You were enrolled in nursing school with a partial scholarship. You'd been the primary stabilizing force in your family for most of your life. You handled problems rather than generating them." A pause. "I needed someone who handled problems." She thought about this. "That's very practical." "It was a practical decision," he said. "And yet," he looked at her, "you could have married someone from one of your business families, someone whose connections would have been useful, someone who wouldn't create the particular headache that I apparently create just by existing in certain rooms." "Yes," he said. "So." He picked up his glass and looked at it. "My wife," he said, and she heard the specific weight that landed on the word, the first wife, the one he didn't name, was practical. The marriage was practical. It served purposes. She was a good woman. He set the glass down. "She died because of who I am, because of what I'd built." The kitchen was very quiet. "I didn't want someone else's daughter drawn into this world because her family needed an alliance," he said. "I wanted someone who was already outside of it, someone who came in knowing what she was choosing and why, who wasn't here because she'd been raised to be here, someone who had her own reasons and her own life before this." Zuri sat with this for a while. "Is that why you're funding my medical degree? You were enrolled in a program before this situation arose. I saw no reason you should lose that." "That's not an answer to the question I asked." Something moved behind his eyes, almost like amusement, but harder or older. "No, he said. I suppose it isn't. They sat in the kitchen for another 40 minutes without talking very much, which was something that she would think about later. How comfortable the silence had been. How strange it was that she'd found it easier to sit quietly in a kitchen with a man she barely knew who happened to be a crime boss than it had been to sit in her own apartment in Chicago in those last weeks before everything fell apart. Duh. She was at Yonsei 2 weeks after that conversation, sitting in the back of a lecture hall trying to take notes in Korean on material that was also partly in English, which was its own particular cognitive chaos, when the message came from Ji-yeon. There's been an incident. You need to come home. She closed her notebook and left before the lecture ended and was in the car within 11 minutes. The drive back to Hanam felt very long. Tae-jin was in the main study when she arrived. 2 of his senior men were with him. She recognized them, had cataloged everyone in the house's security structure in her first 2 weeks because she was her mother's daughter, and her mother had always said that the only room you should ever be confused in was a room you weren't prepared to be in. He looked up when she entered. Something happened to Min-jun, she said. It wasn't a question. She'd read it in the room before anyone spoke. Tae-jin said, he was followed home from school this afternoon. 3 men. His security detail handled it. He's unharmed. She felt something unknot in her chest, which surprised her. She hadn't expected to feel it that specifically. By who? The 2 men in the room exchanged a look. Tae-jin's expression told her the answer to that question was something she was going to hear, but not in front of those 2 men. Go see him, Tae-jin said quietly. He asked for you. She stopped. What? He asked where you were, Tae-jin said, and his voice was the same measured instrument it always was, but something underneath it had changed. He asked if you were home. She stood in the doorway for one long moment, and then she was moving down the hallway toward Min-jun's wing of the house, and the thing expanding in her chest wasn't relief anymore. It was something more complicated and more structural, the weight of a choice she'd already made settling fully into place for the first time. Min-jun was sitting on his bed when she came in, still in his school clothes, a bruise starting to show on the side of his jaw from something that must have happened in the scramble with the security detail. He looked up at her. She didn't say anything. She just crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed beside him, close but not crowding, and waited. After a while he said very quietly, I thought they were after my father. I know, she said. I thought... He stopped, swallowed. I thought they were going to use me to get to him, like they used my mother. The room was very still. She understood now, with a completeness that she hadn't had before, what she was actually in the middle of. Not just a contract, not just an arrangement between adults for adult reasons. She was sitting on the edge of a 15-year-old boy's bed in Seoul, South Korea, and he was trembling and trying not to. And the people who had put her here, all of them, including herself, had made a calculation about what he needed and what this family needed. And she was either going to be adequate to that, or she wasn't. She put her hand on his arm. He didn't pull away. Outside the window, Seoul moved through its evening the way Seoul moved through everything. Enormous, indifferent, lit up against the dark, carrying its 10 million lives forward through whatever came next. And in one room in the Hanam district, Zuri Bennett, who had come here to save her family, and was starting to understand that she might have walked into another one, sat with a grieving, frightened boy and thought about what it meant to stay in a place you hadn't chosen. And whether the choosing happened all at once, or whether it happened slowly, one unretractable moment at a time. She was still thinking about it when the door to the room opened and Tae-jin stood in the frame. He looked at his son. He looked at her hand on his son's arm. Something moved across his face that she had never seen there before. Something that didn't have a name yet, but that she recognized by its shape as the most dangerous thing in any room it occupied. Vulnerability. The men who followed Min-jun today, he said, his voice steady in the particular way of a man holding something steady by force of will. They were sent by someone inside my own organization. The words landed in the room like something dropped. Zuri looked at him. Min-jun went still. Someone I trust, Tae-jin said. Someone I have trusted for years. He looked at her, Seto, directly, with the unguarded attention he almost never allowed himself. And she understood then that he wasn't just telling them what had happened. He was telling her something about what was coming, about the scale of what she'd walked into and the impossibility of walking out. I need to know, he said very quietly, if you are going to stay. The question was not the one in the words. The question in the words was easy. The contract said stay. The debt said stay. The logistics of her life as it now existed said stay. The real question was the one underneath all of that, the one that didn't have paperwork, the one she could feel him actually asking in the space between what he'd said and what he hadn't. She looked at Min-jun, who was watching her with 15 years of grief and 6 weeks of reluctant observation in his eyes. She looked at Tae-jin, standing in the doorway with the weight of a betrayal he hadn't yet named, in a building that was now compromised in a way he was still measuring. She thought about Chicago, about her mother in the walk-in cooler, about the conversation she'd had with herself on the plane somewhere over the Pacific, 35,000 feet above the world, where she'd asked herself what kind of person walked willingly into something like this. She thought about what she'd answered, and the answer was still the same. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, and the sound of someone inside the Kang organization moving against everything Tae-jin had built was already in motion. The betrayal already operationalized, the knives already positioned, and neither of them knew yet how deep the rot went or how close it had already come, or that the person Tae-jin trusted most was sitting across a desk from him at that very moment, in the organization's fortified operations center 3 miles away, in the dark heart of the city, calmly reading an encrypted message that confirmed the first phase had been completed and authorizing the second. The name Tae-jin gave her was Lee Sang-woo. She didn't know who that was at first. She'd been in Seoul for 6 weeks, and her map of the Kang organization's interior was still rough in places. She knew the outer structure, the names of the senior men, the general shape of how decisions moved. But Sang-woo was a layer deeper than what she'd been given access to, and when Tae-jin said the name in the study the following morning, with the particular weight of a man saying something he'd spent the night deciding whether to say, she filed it without reacting and went back to her coffee and waited. He told her more than she expected. Sang-woo was 41, had been with the organization for 19 years since Tae-jin's father had recruited him out of a military background that Tae-jin had never fully audited because Sang-woo had spent a decade proving himself before Tae-jin took over the organization, and the transition had come with its own disruptions and its own things that fell through the cracks. He ran internal operations, the layer of the organization that existed between the legitimate business structure and everything beneath it. Logistics, security, the quiet management of problems that couldn't be handled through the business channels. "He's been with you since before you ran this," she said. "Yes." "And you're certain?" The encrypted message was routed through a server that only 6 people have access to. 4 of those 6 were in meetings with me when it was sent. The 5th is in Tokyo. Tae-jin looked at his coffee. "The 6th is Sang-woo." She thought about this. "Have you confronted him?" "No." "Why not?" He looked up. "Because confronting him tells him I know. And if he's working with someone, if this is an operation and not an individual action, then telling him I know gives whoever is behind him time to move." She nodded slowly. "So you watch him?" "I watch him," Tae-jin said, "and I say nothing. And I go on as though I don't know. And in the meantime, I begin moving things out of his reach, quietly, in ways that look like normal organizational adjustments. That's a very controlled response for finding out that someone you've trusted for 20 years just put your son in danger." He looked at her with the flat precision that she'd come to understand wasn't coldness. It was the expression of a man who had a very tight lid on something very large. "Yes," he said. "It is." She believed him, which was its own strange thing to notice. Jan, Min-jun found out 3 days later. She didn't know how. Tae-jin hadn't told him, and the household staff had been given no information. But Min-jun was 15 and had grown up inside a world where information moved in ways that adults couldn't fully control, and he had inherited his father's intelligence without yet having his father's discipline, which meant he'd found the thing and pulled on it until it unraveled. He came to her room, not his father's study. That told her something. He knocked once, came in without waiting for an answer, and stood in the middle of the room with his jaw set and his eyes doing the thing they did when he was keeping something inside by force rather than by choice. "Sang-woo," he said. She set down the medical textbook. "Sit down." "I don't want to sit down." "I didn't ask what you wanted." He sat, not gracefully. The way a boy sat when sitting felt like surrender, but the body was tired enough to take it anyway. She looked at him. He was holding it together by a thread. She could see the effort in his shoulders, in the way his hands were pressed flat against his thighs. "Your father knows," she said. He's handling it. He's handling it." The repetition came out like something bitten off. Sang-woo was at my mother's funeral. He stood in the front row. He held my father up when he stopped, swallowed hard. He was at her funeral. Zuri said nothing. "He knew my mother," Minjun said. "He knew me since I was a kid. He called me on my birthday every year until I was 13 and told my father I was too old for that. The words were coming faster now, losing their organization. He had someone follow me home. He used me. To do what, exactly? To scare my father? To warn him? To what? We don't know yet what the full operation is," she said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." She heard her own voice from 6 weeks ago in a restaurant in Chicago, saying those same words to a man she'd never met. The world cycled. "Your father is moving carefully because moving carelessly gives whoever is behind this time to disappear. I know that's not satisfying. I know it feels like nothing is being done. But something is being done. It's just being done quietly." Minjun looked at her. His face was doing the complicated work of a 15-year-old boy who was deciding whether to trust someone, and she knew better than to rush it. "Why did he tell you?" he said finally. "What?" "My father. Why did he tell you about Sang-woo? He doesn't tell people things. He hasn't. Since my mother, he doesn't tell people things." She didn't have a clean answer to that. She thought about the kitchen, midnight, his father's hands around a glass, the quality of the silence that had existed between them. She thought about what it meant that Tae-jin had walked into his son's room that night and asked her, directly in front of Minjun, whether she was staying. "I don't know," she said, which was mostly true. Minjun looked at his hands. "I don't want anything to happen to him," he said quietly. Stripped of the armor that usually carried his words, the sentence was just what it was. A boy who'd already lost one parent sitting with the specific terror of losing another. "I know," she said. "If Sang-woo is working with someone, your father has been running this organization for 15 years. He's survived things that would have ended most people." She paused. "And he has people around him now." Minjun looked up at her. Something in his face shifted. The very specific expression of someone hearing a thing that they'd needed to hear and not having expected to find it where they found it. He left without saying anything else. She sat with the medical textbook closed on the bed beside her and thought about what she'd just said and whether she'd meant it. She had. That was the part that kept surprising her. Taejin's mother arrived from Busan on a Thursday without warning. Her name was Kang Myung-ja. She was 73 years old, still sharp in the manner of a woman who had spent decades in rooms where sharpness was the only available currency. And she walked into the Hanam residence with the proprietary ease of someone who had spent years walking into it and had never stopped considering it hers, regardless of who technically owned it now. Zuri was in the garden when the car arrived. She'd made a habit of the garden in the early morning, an hour before her Korean tutor arrived, when the house was still quiet and she could sit with the strangeness of her life without the day's performance requirements attaching themselves to every thought. She heard the car, heard the shift in the house's energy that came with it, and knew before she turned around that whatever was coming was going to require her full attention. She met Myung-ja in the main receiving room. The woman looked at her the way a jeweler looked at something that had been represented to them as a diamond, with the specific focus of someone who expected to find a flaw and would not be embarrassed by finding it. She said something in Korean, and Ji Yeon, who had appeared at Zuri's shoulder with the silent timing that was her particular skill, translated in a murmur. "She says you are younger than she imagined." "Tell her I'm older than I look," Zuri said. Ji Yeon translated. Myungja's expression didn't change, but something in her posture adjusted fractionally. She said something else. "She asks what your father does." "My father left when I was 10, Zuri said. "My mother runs a restaurant." The translation. A pause. Myungja spoke. "She says that is not the background she hoped for in a wife for her son." Zuri looked at the older woman directly. Not defiantly, not submissively, just steadily. Tell her that with respect, the background I came from made me exactly the person I am, and that the person I am is the one her son chose. The translation landed. Myungja looked at her for a long moment. Then she said something shorter. Jiyeon hesitated slightly. She says, "We will see." "Yes," Zuri said, "we will." Asa. That evening, Taejin came to find her. She was in the small library on the second floor, working through Korean vocabulary lists with the grim focus she'd developed for things she found difficult. And he knocked on the open door frame and waited, which was something she'd noticed he always did. Waited at the threshold until she acknowledged him, as if the room she was using had temporarily become hers in some way that he respected. "My mother spoke to you this morning," he said. "She did." He came into the room, didn't sit, stood by the window with his hands in his pockets, and looked out at the garden in the dark. "She is going to be here for 2 weeks, possibly 3. Okay. She will be difficult." I got that impression. He turned from the window. There was something in his face, not quite discomfort, because she wasn't sure he did discomfort in the ordinary sense, but something adjacent to it. "She does not object to you personally," he said. "I want you to understand that. Her objection is to the arrangement," Zuri said, "to the practicality of it, to the fact that her son chose function over dynasty." She looked up from the vocabulary list. "I understand. It's not personal because she doesn't know me well enough for it to be personal yet." He looked at her. "Yet." "I've been here 6 weeks," she said. "I'm not going to earn anything in 6 weeks. That's not how it works." "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." A pause. "She lost her husband 4 years ago," he said. "My father. The organization was their shared project for 40 years. She built as much of it as he did in ways that people didn't acknowledge because of the time and the culture. After he died," he stopped, chose words carefully. "She has strong opinions about what the organization should be and what the family should represent. And a black woman from Chicago doesn't fit those opinions." "No. But you brought me here anyway." He looked at her steadily. "Yes." She thought about asking why again. The real why, the one that wasn't about logistics or politics or the architecture of an arranged marriage. But she could see something in the set of his jaw that told her this wasn't the night for it, and she'd learned to read the terrain before she moved. "I'll manage your mother," she said. "Don't intercede on my behalf. Let me handle it." Something surprised him. It moved across his face quickly, but she caught it. "She can be genuinely unpleasant. So can I," Zuri said, "when I need to be." The unpleasantness came on the 5th day. It came in the form of a dinner that Myungja organized, without asking Taejin, without notifying Zuri until the morning of, that included 8 women from Seoul's established Korean families, the wives and daughters of men who ran the organizations and corporations and political relationships that made up the world the Kong family moved in. The message in the invitation was not subtle. "This is who belongs here, and we would all like to see how you measure against the standard." Zuri put on the burgundy dress, which by now had developed a small private significance, and went. She sat at a table for 9 and listened to conversations that moved in and around her in Korean, and she caught about a third of it now, more than people realized she could follow, which was a piece of information she kept to herself. She caught the joke that 2 of the younger women made at her expense, something about the difficulty of fitting into garments designed for a Korean figure, and she smiled at something Jiyeon was saying and let them think she hadn't understood. But what she caught, and what she filed carefully, was the dynamic between Myungja and the other women. The way they deferred to her, the specific way she held a room, not with loudness or force, but with the quiet authority of a woman who had been the center of gravity in her world for 40 years and had no intention of stepping aside. Halfway through the dinner, during a pause in the conversation, Myungja said something that the table went still for. Jiyeon's voice in her ear was very quiet. She says, "She is telling a story about when Taejin was married before, about his first wife. She's saying that Song Yi, that was her name, that Song Yi understood what it meant to be a Kong wife, that she was raised for it, that she knew what to give and what to hold." Zuri listened to the story. She kept her face completely neutral. She let Myung-ja finish it, let the table absorb it, let the specific silence that followed it say everything it was designed to say. Then she said, in Korean, imperfect, accented, but clear. Song-yi sounds like she was a remarkable woman. I hope I can honor what she meant to this family. The table was very still. Myung-ja looked at her. Zuri held the gaze. After a moment, one of the older women at the table, Park Sung-ho's mother-in-law, who was somewhere in her 80s and had been mostly silent all evening, said something. Ji-yeon translated barely above a breath. She says your Korean is coming along. It was the smallest possible acknowledgement. It meant almost nothing and almost everything. Myung-ja said nothing for the rest of the dinner, which was its own kind of answer. Wokon. On the 8th day of Myung-ja's visit, Sang-woo had dinner at the house. Taejin had invited him. Routine. Nothing that would signal a change. Zuri sat at the table and watched Sang-woo across the food and the conversation and the performance of normalcy, and she understood for the first time with her body, rather than just her mind, what it meant to be in a room with someone who wanted to destroy the thing you were sitting inside of. He was 50, not 41. She'd misremembered from what Taejin had told her, or Taejin had misremembered. He had a broad face and tired eyes, and the physical ease of a man who'd been comfortable in dangerous rooms for decades. He was warm toward Min-jun in a way that made her stomach tighten. He asked the boy about school, about a basketball league he apparently knew Min-jun had joined, about whether his Korean literature grade had improved from the last term. Min-jun answered shortly and didn't look at the man's face, which Sang-woo either didn't notice or noticed, and chose to read as normal teenage distance. Taejin was immaculate. That was the only word. Whatever it cost him to sit across from this man and pass food and pour drinks and respond to his observations about the shipping market, none of it reached his surface. He was the same controlled, contained instrument he always was, and Zuri watched him perform it, and felt something new. Not admiration exactly, but something close. A recognition of a specific kind of strength that looked like stillness from the outside. She was watching Taejin's face when she felt Sang-woo's eyes land on her. She looked over. He was smiling, polite and interested, the smile of a man making an effort. Your Korean is improving, he said. Taejin mentioned you've been working hard at it. I have, she said. It's not easy for foreigners. The grammar structure is very different from English. It is, she agreed. But I have good teachers. And good motivation, he said, still smiling. A lot to learn, a lot to understand about how things work here, how things are connected. The sentence was nothing. The sentence was perfectly ordinary, and yet something in the way he delivered it, the slight emphasis that probably only she heard because she was already listening for the edges of things, made the hairs on her arms lift. She smiled back. I'm a quick study, she said. The dinner ended normally. Sang-woo left at 9. Taejin walked him to the door with every surface correct and came back to the dining room and looked at Zuri and said nothing. And she said nothing, and Myung-ja, who had been watching all of it with the careful eyes of a woman who had been reading rooms since before either of them were born, looked between them and then looked at her tea. It was Myung-ja who came to her room that night. Zuri heard the knock and opened the door and found the older woman standing in the hallway in a plain house robe without the armor of the public presentation and looking for the first time like a 73-year-old woman who was tired. She stepped back without saying anything. Myung-ja came in. They sat in the chairs by the window, which Zuri had always thought of as the honest chairs, the ones where the formal arrangement of the room didn't apply. Myung-ja looked out at the garden for a while. Then she said, in Korean, slowly enough that Zuri could follow most of it. I watched you at dinner tonight, with Sang-woo. Zuri waited. You knew something was wrong with him, Myung-ja said. I saw it in your eyes, the way you stayed very still. Zuri said carefully, I was being careful. Yes. A pause. My son is also being careful. He has been since before you came. I can see it in him. The specific kind of careful that he gets when something has already hurt him and he has not yet decided how to respond. She looked at Zuri. What is it? The question was direct in the way of old women who had stopped having the patience for circling. Zuri thought about what Taijin had told her, and why he'd told her, and what she owed him in terms of the information. Then she thought about the woman sitting across from her, who had built this family as much as anyone, who had watched her daughter-in-law die, who had raised the son who was currently holding himself together with a lid that was getting harder to keep on. There's a threat inside the organization, Zuri said. Taijin is handling it. I can't tell you more than that. Myungjia looked at her for a long time. Song Yi didn't know about threats, she said finally. Not cruelly, just as a fact. Taijin kept things from her because he wanted to protect her. She died not knowing what was coming. Her voice was steady. He is not keeping things from you. Zuri said nothing. That is not a small thing, Myungjia said. For a man like my son. She stood up, straightened her robe, and moved toward the door with the careful dignity of someone whose knees hurt, but who wasn't going to let that be visible. At the threshold, she stopped. The Korean at dinner was adequate, she said, without turning around. Then she left. Zuri sat in the honest chairs for a long time after the door closed. Outside, Seoul was still going, enormous and lit and indifferent, carrying its million threads forward. Somewhere out there, Sang-woo was in a car or at a desk or making a phone call, and whatever he was building was still being built, and Tae-jin was in his study 3 rooms away holding his lid on with both hands. Her phone lit up. A message from a Chicago number she still had in her contacts, even though she'd told herself she was going to delete it. Marcus. Hey, you okay? Haven't heard from you. She stared at the message, thought about her brother's hands taking money from the register, thought about the walk-in cooler, her mother's arms, thought about all the steps between that kitchen in Chicago and this chair in Seoul, each one of which had led directly to the next. She put the phone face down on the chair arm without answering. In the morning, Tae-jin called her into the study before breakfast. His face was the controlled instrument it always was, but there was something different in it. Something that had been there since the dinner with Sang-woo and was now more present, closer to the surface. The operation Sang-woo is running is larger than I thought, he said. He's not acting alone, and it's not a rival syndicate. The people behind him... He stopped, set a file on the desk between them, turned it so she could read the name on the front. They're inside the Korean business network, the legitimate side, the political relationships. She looked at the name on the file. Park Sung-ho, his largest legitimate business partner. The man whose wife had called her exotic at that first dinner. The man whose mother-in-law had been the only one to acknowledge her Korean at the table last week. He's been funneling money through the shipping conglomerate, Tae-jin said, to fund a coordinated effort to break the Kang organization apart. Not destroy it, absorb it, take the legitimate holdings, collapse the criminal infrastructure, divide the territory. He looked at her. Sang-woo was supposed to deliver Min-jun as leverage. Not harm him. Hold him, to force my hand. The room was very cold suddenly. They were going to take your son, she said. Yes. And use him to make you sign over the organization. Yes. She thought about Min-jun sitting on his bed with the bruise starting on his jaw, asking if they were going to use him the way they'd used his mother. When does Park move? She said. Tae-jin's jaw tightened. I don't know. Soon. He knows that I met with our security partners last week. He has eyes inside those meetings, which means he knows I'm aware something is happening. He doesn't know that I know it's him, but he'll calculate that it's only a matter of time. So he'll move before you can consolidate. Yes. She stood, crossed to the window, looked at the street below. Morning Seoul, ordinary and enormous. People moving to work, cars in lines, the city just being the city, indifferent to whatever was unraveling in this room. What do you need from me? She said. Tae-jin was quiet. She turned. He was looking at her with the unguarded attention again. The look she'd only seen a few times, that didn't fit the face he wore for the rest of the world. I need you to attend the Park family's charity event on Saturday, he said, as my wife, normally, without indicating that anything has changed. You need me to sit in a room with the man who just tried to have your son kidnapped and smile at him. Yes. She breathed in slowly. Okay. Park's wife will be there, his entire family network. If anything in your behavior signals that Tae-jin knows, if anything I do on Saturday suggests it, he moves that night and we lose the window. She nodded. There is one more thing, he said. Something in his tone made her go still. The network Park is working with has people in Los Angeles, Tae-jin said. Their leverage over me is not only Min Jun. He picked up the second file on the desk. Set it down. They have been building a case against your brother, Marcus. A case that ties him to the original debt in a way that carries criminal exposure. They will use him, as an additional pressure point if I don't comply. The air in the room changed. Marcus? She said. He's been contacted already. He doesn't know the full picture, but he's been approached by someone claiming to offer him a way to clear his remaining obligations. If he takes the offer, he'll sign documents that create a financial trail that Park's lawyers can use against both him and you, which compromises your status here and gives them a legal mechanism to invalidate our marriage, which unravels everything I've been building as a structural protection for the organization. She was very still. They're going to use my brother, she said, to get to me, to get to you. Yes. And there it was, the shape of it finally fully visible, all the edges present at once. She'd come here to save her brother from one impossible situation, and the world had built another one around him while she wasn't watching, because that was what Marcus did. Not with malice, not with cruelty, but with the particular genius for catastrophe that had defined him since childhood, the inability to recognize the edge of a cliff until he was already falling. She looked at the file with her brother's name on it. She looked at the man across the desk from her, who was watching her with those careful eyes and waiting to see what she was made of under the specific weight of this particular moment. And she thought, Marcus. And she thought, Min Jun. And she thought about her mother in the walk-in cooler, holding on. And she said, in a voice that didn't shake, that she would not allow to shake, tell me everything I need to know before Saturday. She spent 4 days learning the architecture of a trap. Tae-jin gave her files. Not all of them. She understood that there were layers he was still protecting, lines of information he kept inside himself because that was how he'd survived 15 years of running something that wanted to kill him at regular intervals. But he gave her enough. The Park network. The financial structure. The specific mechanism by which Marcus had been approached. A man named David Cho, Los Angeles-based, who presented himself as a debt resolution consultant and had met Marcus twice at a coffee shop in Koreatown and offered him a pathway out that involved signing what looked like a settlement agreement but was actually a liability transfer document that would have made Marcus legally complicit in a series of wire transfers that Park's lawyers had been building for 8 months. Marcus had not yet signed. He was thinking about it. She knew this because she called him on Tuesday night, flat out, no preamble, and asked him directly what David Cho had offered him and whether he'd taken it. There was a silence on the line that told her everything before his voice did. How do you know about Cho? He said. Marcus, have you signed anything? Not yet. He said I had until Friday to... Do not sign anything. Do you hear me? Nothing. Not a settlement, not a release, not a piece of paper with that man's name on it. Zuri, he said it would clear everything. The debt, the whole... It won't clear anything. It will make you a legal instrument in a case against your own sister, and I need you to trust me, and I need you to trust me right now, tonight, before you sleep on it and talk yourself into it. Do not sign anything. Another silence. Longer. She could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, the specific rhythm of a man who wanted to be saved, and was being asked, again, to hold on just a little longer, which was the ask that had always been the hardest one for Marcus to answer. Okay, he said finally. Okay, I won't. She hung up and sat very still and thought about the texture of his okay, whether it had the weight of a promise or just the weight of not wanting to argue. She couldn't tell. She'd never been able to tell with Marcus, which was the central tragedy of loving him. Saturday came in cold and clear, which Seoul did well in November. The air with a blade in it. The sky a specific shade of pale that made the city look like it had been rinsed. The park charity event was held at a hotel in Jongno, a grand, high-ceilinged ballroom that had been decorated for a children's hospital fundraiser in a way that was tasteful and expensive and thoroughly insulated from any actual sense of urgency about sick children. The kind of event where the cause was the occasion for the gathering rather than the point of it. Zuri wore dark green. Jiyeon had found it, a dress that was serious without being severe, that said, I belong here without saying I'm trying to belong here, which was the specific distinction that mattered in this room. She'd spent an hour on her Korean that morning, not vocabulary, but cadence, working with her tutor on the specific registers of polite speech, the formal structures that conveyed respect without subservience. She was ready. She was also afraid, which she filed somewhere in the middle of her chest where it would stay compressed and not reach her face. Taejin drove with her. They sat in the back of the car in the particular quiet of two people who have said everything necessary and are now just waiting for the thing to begin. At some point, maybe 4 minutes from the hotel, his hand rested on the seat between them, and she looked at it for a moment and then put her hand on top of it. Not intertwined, just placed. He didn't move, didn't look at her, just left his hand where it was, and they arrived like that. Park Sung-ho was at the entrance receiving people when they walked in. He was 60, heavy through the shoulders, with the particular confidence of a man who had spent his life being thanked for things. He saw Tae-jin coming, and his face assembled itself into warmth, skilled warmth, practiced warmth. But she could see the calculation underneath it, now that she was looking for it. The specific tightening around his eyes when he looked past Tae-jin to her. "Tae-jin," he said in Korean, clasping his hand. "And your wife, how wonderful." Zuri smiled. "Mr. Park, what a beautiful venue. The children's hospital work you support is so important." He blinked, almost imperceptibly, at her Korean. Then the smile came back, professionally adjusted. "You've been studying," he said. "Every day," she said. "This is my home now. I want to understand it." The word home landed in the sentence with more weight than she'd quite intended, but when she saw the fractional reaction in his face, she understood it had also landed correctly. The message received was, "She is staying. She is not a temporary arrangement. Disrupting this marriage disrupts something with roots now." She let Tae-jin lead her into the room, and they separated over the next 2 hours the way they'd planned. Him to the business conversations, her to the table of wives and philanthropists where she listened and smiled and tracked everything. She was looking for Park's wife specifically, for the structure of the woman's conversations, for any indication of what she knew and how much. Park's wife, Jung-ah, knew something. Zuri could feel it in the quality of the woman's attention. The way she watched Tae-jin across the room with the specific surveillance of someone monitoring a situation rather than observing a guest. Zuri filed it and said nothing and ate her dinner and waited. It was during the event's formal program, speeches, a video about the hospital, polite applause, that her phone moved in her clutch. She kept her eyes forward and reached in and felt the screen without looking. A message from a number she didn't recognize. She didn't look at it until the speech ended and the room began its post-program circulation, and she was able to step briefly toward the edge of the room under the cover of looking for the restrooms. The message read, "Your brother signed the documents this morning. Cho moved the meeting to Thursday. I'm sorry. D." She stood very still. D. She didn't know a D, but someone had her number, and someone was telling her that Marcus, who had said okay in a voice that didn't quite have the weight of a promise, had signed the documents this morning, 4 days before Friday, and now the legal mechanism Park needed to invalidate everything was in motion. She breathed in once, very carefully, through her nose. She put the phone away. She went back to the table and sat down and smiled at the woman to her left, who was saying something about a new children's wing, and she nodded and made an appropriate sound, and behind her eyes she was doing very fast arithmetic about what came next. She told Tae-jin at the car on the way home. She read him the message. His face didn't change. She watched it the entire time she was reading, and not one thing moved in it, which was its own kind of information. The absolute stillness of a man receiving a blow he'd already partially calculated the possibility of. "Thursday," he said. "That's what it says. That's 4 days. Yes." He looked out the window. The city moved past them, indifferent and enormous. "Who sent the message?" she said. "I don't know yet." He was already reaching for his own phone with the other hand. "But someone who has eyes on your brother's movements and who wanted you to know before I could manage how you found out." She sat with that. "Meaning it could be someone trying to help or someone trying to create a problem between us." "Yes." She looked at her hands in her lap. Her hands were very still, which was taking some effort. "I told him not to sign," she said. "I know. I called him Tuesday, and I told him directly." "I know," Tae-jin said, and his voice had the quality that she'd learned to recognize as the way he said things when he wanted to stop a spiral. Not dismissive, more like a hand placed on something that was starting to accelerate. This is not a failure of what you said to him. It's a failure of what he is, and that's not something you can fix from here. She sat with that for a long time. When they got home, she went to her room and sat in the honest chairs and thought about Marcus with a fury that was clean and specific and didn't ask anything from her except that she feel it and then set it down. She felt it. She set it down. She picked up her Korean vocabulary cards and worked for 40 minutes because the alternative was sitting with what she couldn't change, and she'd never been built for that. The call came from Tae-jin's study at 11 that night. She heard it through the wall, not the words, just the tone, the specific compressed quality of a man who was getting bad news and containing his response to it. She sat up in bed and waited. 12 minutes later, there was a knock on her door. She opened it. His face was the controlled instrument. But she was close enough now, had mapped the terrain of it well enough to see what lived underneath the instrument tonight. Something that was not quite fear and not quite grief, but occupied the territory between them. "Sang-woo is gone," he said. She went still. "He left the city this afternoon. His apartment has been cleared, not packed, cleared in a hurry. His phone is offline." A pause. "He took files, digital copies of the organization's internal operational structure, somehow safe house locations, security protocols, the names of 15 people in our network who have protected identities." She understood what this meant before he said the next part. "Park moves tonight," she said. "I believe so, yes." She stepped back and let him in. He came in and stood by the window the same way he always stood by windows, hands in his pockets, looking at the city. She crossed to the desk and picked up her phone. "Min-jun," she said, "already handled. He's in the secure room in the East Wing with two of my most trusted people, both of whom I've kept entirely outside of Sang-woo's operational knowledge." She nodded. "Your mother?" "Being moved to a secondary location tonight. She doesn't know why yet. She'll figure it out." "Yes." A pause. "She will." She looked at her phone, at the message from the unknown number, at Marcus's name sitting in her recent calls like an accusation. "The documents Marcus signed," she said. "What's the timeline before Park's lawyers can file?" 48 hours, maybe. They need to complete the chain of transfers first. "Is there a way to—" "I have 3 lawyers working on it now," he said. "The document Marcus signed was technically a consent form for a financial review. It has legal implications, but it isn't, on its face, a confession. My people believe they can build a counter-argument. It will take time and it will be expensive and it will require Marcus to cooperate fully with what they tell him to do." She thought about Marcus cooperating fully. She thought about all the times in their lives when she'd needed him to cooperate fully with something and the specific record of his performance. "I'll handle Marcus," she said. Tae-jin turned from the window. "I'll handle him," she said again. "Tell your lawyers what they need from him and I will make sure he does it. That's not your problem." He looked at her. "You don't have to—" "Yes, I do." Her voice was steady, and the steadiness was real, not performed. "He's my brother. His mess entered your life because of me. I'm not going to sit here while your lawyers manage him like a variable in a case. I'll call him right now." "It's 2 in the afternoon in Chicago." "Good." She was already pulling up his number. "He'll be awake," she called. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She called again. 3 rings this time, then, "Zuri?" He sounded like he'd been asleep or close to it, which didn't make sense at 2 in the afternoon, but was something she didn't have time to unpack. "You signed the documents," she said. Silence. "Marcus?" "He moved the meeting. He said if I didn't come Thursday, I would lose the window entirely, and then everything we talked about before the—" "Stop," she breathed. "Stop explaining. I don't need the explanation right now. I need you to listen to me very carefully and do exactly what I say." "Zuri, exactly what I say. Can you do that?" A long pause. She could hear him breathing, could hear the specific quality of a man who knew he'd done it again, the specific shame of it, and the specific way that shame made him want to argue or explain or diminish rather than just sit in it. "Yeah," he said. "Tomorrow morning you are going to get a call from a lawyer named Yoon Ji-ho. Korean name, speaks English, based in Los Angeles. You will answer that call and you will do everything he tells you to do without argument and without modification, and without consulting David Cho or anyone connected to David Cho. Do you understand me? Who is this lawyer? He works for my husband, she said, and it was the first time she'd used the word without qualification, without the slight ironic distance that she'd been using it with for 6 weeks. And he is the only thing standing between you and a criminal liability case that would end your life as a free person. The silence on the other end of the line was different now, denser. How bad is it? Marcus said. Bad enough that I'm calling you at 2 a.m. Seoul time to tell you to answer a phone call tomorrow. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I'm sorry. She closed her eyes. The sorry arrived with its usual weight. Genuine, insufficient, the apology of a man who meant it completely in the moment and would mean the next one just as completely when it came. She'd been receiving Marcus's sorries her whole life, and she was too tired right now to do anything with this one except put it somewhere and move on. Answer the phone tomorrow, she said. That's all I need from you tonight. She hung up. Tae-jin was still by the window. He'd heard all of it. He didn't comment on it, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. Park's people will make a move on this house tonight or tomorrow, he said. Not openly. They will look for leverage first. Information, an incident they can use, something that destabilizes the environment before they commit to a direct action. How do you know? Because that's how I would do it, he said simply. She looked at him. The city light was coming through the window and cutting across the side of his face, and she thought, not for the first time, that there was something in this man that was genuinely difficult to look at directly. Not because it was ugly, but because it was too present, too specific, too much like looking at the actual architecture of a person rather than the surface they'd built. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. The attack on my convoy 6 years ago, he said. The one that killed Song Yi. The room changed the way rooms changed when certain words came into them. Sang-woo knew it was coming, he said. She didn't move. I didn't know this until 40 minutes ago. There's a file I found in the copies he left behind, possibly by accident, possibly as a message, that shows communication between Sang-woo and the organization that planned the attack. Not coordination, not planning, but advanced knowledge. He knew the route. He knew the timing. He said nothing. Tae-jin's voice was the controlled instrument, but underneath it something was moving that she'd never heard in it before. My wife died in an attack that my most trusted man knew was coming and chose not to prevent. The silence in the room was absolute. She thought about Min Jun saying he was at my mother's funeral. He stood in the front row. He held my father up. She thought about the birthday calls until Min Jun was 13. She thought about Sang-woo at the dinner table, asking about the basketball league. Tae-jin, she said. Don't. His voice was very quiet. I need a few minutes. She didn't push. She stood in her room with this man and the weight of what he'd just said and let the few minutes be what they were. When he spoke again, his voice had the instrument quality back, mostly. This changes the nature of what Park has on Sang-woo, he said. This isn't about Sang-woo being paid for betrayal. This is about Sang-woo being blackmailed for something he did 6 years ago. Park found the file. Park has been controlling Sang-woo for, I don't know how long, years possibly. Everything Sang-woo did, the information he passed, the operation against Min Jun, Park directed it using this as leverage. She thought through the implications of this. So Sang-woo isn't an enemy. Sang-woo is a man who let my wife die, and then spent 6 years in my house carrying that, Tae-jin said. I don't have a clean category for what that makes him. She didn't either. But it means, she said carefully, that if you can find him before Park does, he becomes a witness rather than an adversary, Tae-jin said. He knows everything Park built, every person, every payment, every operation. He paused. If I can reach him before Park has him killed. She heard the words and let them arrange themselves in the particular order that made the picture. Park is going to kill Sang-woo, she said. Park needs Sang-woo dead before Sang-woo can be turned, Tae-jin said. Yes, tonight or tomorrow. Same window as whatever move they make here. She was already thinking, already moving through it. The message I got at the event tonight, she said. The unknown number. Someone who knew about Marcus, knew about the documents, knew enough to warn me. Tae-jin looked at her. Could be Sang-woo, she said. He was very still. He cleared his apartment. He went dark. But he sent that message, or had it sent. She felt the shape of it assembling. He's not running from you, he's running from Park. And he told me about Marcus because he's trying to... Her phone lit up on the desk between them, the same unknown number. She looked at Tae-jin. He nodded once. She answered. The voice on the other end was a man's voice, middle-aged, Korean-accented English, slightly compressed the way voices got when someone was speaking quietly in a space where they were afraid of being heard. "Mrs. Kang," the voice said. She kept her eyes on Tae-jin's face. "Yes. You need to tell your husband that I have the original files. Not copies, the originals. Everything Park used to build the case. Everything that connects every payment, every operation, every name." A pause. "I have been carrying something for 6 years that I cannot carry anymore. If Tae-jin will meet me, I will give him everything." Her heart was beating very fast. Her voice stayed even. "Where are you?" A longer pause. She could hear him deciding. "Tell him I'm at the place where his father used to go when he needed to think," Sang-woo said. "He'll know." The line went dead. She lowered the phone and looked at Tae-jin. His face had done something she'd never seen it do. For just a moment, 3 seconds, maybe 4, the instrument was completely gone. What was underneath it was not what she'd expected. It wasn't rage or grief or the cold calculation she'd come to associate with how he processed crisis. It was the face of a man who was standing at the edge of something that was going to cost him regardless of which direction he moved. He took the phone from her hand gently and looked at the number. Then he looked up. "I have to go," he said. "I know. This could be a trap. Park could have turned him back, could be using him to draw me out of the—" "I know," she said again. "You still have to go." He looked at her with those unguarded eyes, and she held the look, and didn't flinch from what was in it, because flinching wasn't available to her anymore. Hadn't been since she sat down across a table from this man in her mother's restaurant and made the choice that led to every other choice in a chain that had brought her to this room, this city. This specific moment with the cold coming through the window and the city burning below them, and a 15-year-old boy in the East Wing who had already lost too much. "If I'm not back by dawn," he started. "You'll be back by dawn," she said. It wasn't a comfort, it was a declaration. He heard the difference. She watched him hear it. He moved toward the door, and she stayed where she was. And when he reached the threshold, he paused, one hand on the doorframe, back still to her, and said something in Korean quietly that she understood because she'd been working every morning for 6 weeks and because some things didn't require translation. He said, "Don't let anything happen to my son." She said, "Go." And the door closed, and she was alone in the room with the city outside the window and the phone in her hand and the specific knowledge that the trap, if it was a trap, wasn't the meeting Tae-jin was driving toward. The trap was already here, inside the house, in the shape of a plan that was already... The trap was already here, inside the house, in the shape of a plan that was already moving. She understood this the moment the door closed behind Tae-jin, not because she had specific information, she didn't, not yet, but because she'd been thinking like someone inside the situation for long enough that the logic of it had become instinctive. Park needed Tae-jin out of the house. The meeting with Sang-woo accomplished that regardless of whether it was genuine or staged, which meant the house, right now, with Tae-jin's car pulling out of the gate and the security detail redistributed to cover his movement, was the softest it had been since she arrived. She was already moving when the thought finished forming. She crossed the hall to the room where Ji-yeon stayed when events required an overnight, and knocked twice, hard. Ji-yeon opened the door in 20 seconds, already half awake, which told Zuri something about the quality of the woman's instincts. "Get dressed," Zuri said. "Come to the East Wing. Don't use the main corridor." Ji-yeon looked at her face and asked nothing. The door closed. Zuri went to Min-jun's secure room through the servants' passage that ran behind the East Wing's walls. She'd mapped it in her second week, the way she'd mapped everything, because her mother's daughter didn't stay anywhere without knowing where the exits were. The passage was narrow and dark, and smelled of old wood, and she moved through it fast with one hand on the wall and came out through the panel in the room adjacent to Min-jun's. The 2 guards Tae-jin had placed were there. She recognized them, Baek and Choi, both in their 30s, both from the inner security layer that Sang-woo had never had access to. She'd memorized their faces in the first week because she'd been raised in a neighborhood where knowing who was supposed to be in a space and who wasn't was a survival skill, not a hobby. Status? She said. Beck looked surprised for 1 second, then adjusted. Quiet. No movement on the perimeter. Taejin just left the property, she said. Which means if someone is going to move tonight, it's in the next hour. I need you to treat this room as if the gate is already compromised. They looked at each other. Mrs. Kang, Choi started. I'm not asking you to override Taejin's orders, she said. I'm asking you to take them seriously. He told you to protect his son. I'm telling you the window just opened. Those two things are the same instruction. She knocked on Min Jun's door and went in. He was awake. Of course he was. He was 15, and something was happening, and he was his father's son. He was sitting on the bed in a t-shirt and track pants with his back against the headboard, and his jaw set in the particular way that meant he was afraid and refusing to perform it. Where's my father? He said. Out. He'll be back. She crossed to the window. Ground floor of the east wing, garden facing, the wall 12 meters away. She checked the lock. Solid. She moved to the second window. Same. Do you have a phone on you? Yeah. Keep it in your hand. My number is in it. Taejin put it there. If anyone comes through that door who isn't me or Baek or Choi, you call me before anything else. Not the police. Not anyone else. Me first. What's happening? She turned and looked at him. He deserved something real. She gave him what she had. Someone is going to try to use you tonight to get to your father. I'm not going to let that happen. He was quiet for a moment. Sang-woo? Sang-woo is gone. Someone else. His jaw worked. How many? She almost smiled, the question of a boy who had grown up in this world and knew it had mathematics. I don't know yet. He nodded once, pulled his knees up and put his back harder against the headboard and held his phone and waited. She thought of everything she might have said to him and said none of it and went back to the door. Jeon was in the passage. Zuri pulled the panel open and brought her in, and they stood in the small room adjacent to Minjun's, and she laid it out fast. I need you translating. Live. In real time. If anyone comes to this wing in the next 2 hours who isn't household staff we both recognize, I need to know exactly what they're saying the moment they say it. Can you do that? Yes, Jiyeon said. If it goes badly and you need to get out, take Minjun through the servants' passage to the kitchen exit. There's a car in the service bay that Taejin keeps with keys in the console. You drive until you can call the number in my phone under the name Song. That's his operations deputy, the one outside Sang-woo's loop. You call Song and you say the word Wednesday. He'll understand. Jiyeon absorbed this with the focus of a woman who was more than a translator and had always been more than a translator and was letting Zuri see that now because the situation required it. And you? I'll be where I need to be, Zuri said. She went to the study. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for until she found it. Tae-jin's desk had a false bottom in the right drawer, which she'd discovered by accident 3 weeks ago and had filed without comment because it wasn't her place yet and because she understood that trust in this house was something built in layers. The bottom held a phone, separate from his main line, a clean number, and a small folded paper with 6 numbers on it. She looked at the numbers for a moment. Then she called the last one. It rang twice. A man's voice, alert, no greeting. Yes. This is Zuri Kang, she said. Taejin went to the old thinking place. He's been gone 22 minutes. I believe the house is a secondary target. I need eyes on the perimeter now, not from the main security channel. A pause. 2 seconds. How do you know about this number? Because I pay attention, she said. Are you going to help me or not? Another pause, shorter. I have 2 men, 2 blocks out, rotating. Get them on the wall. They're already moving, the voice said. Stay on this line. She put the phone in her jacket pocket and went to the main corridor and stood at the top of the stairs and listened to the house. The house had its sounds, the refrigerator's hum, the heating system's low breath, the specific creak of the floor 2 rooms down that happened when the temperature shifted. She'd cataloged all of it in the first 2 weeks. The creak happened. Then it happened again. Someone was in the E study. Someone who weighed enough to trigger that floorboard and who was moving slowly enough to be trying not to. She went down the stairs without a sound. The east study door was open 2 inches. She came to it from the side, flat against the wall, and listened. And through the gap she could hear breathing and the specific soft sound of drawers being opened and closed with care. She pushed the door open. The man inside turned. He was Korean, mid-30s, in dark clothes, and he had a small device in his hand. Transmitter. She recognized it from the security briefing files Tae-jin had walked her through, that he'd been about to attach to the underside of the desk. He stared at her. She stared at him. For exactly 2 seconds, neither of them moved. Then she said loud and flat, "Baek!" The guard appeared behind her in 3 seconds. The man in the study bolted for the window. He didn't make it. Baek was fast in the uncomplicated way of men trained specifically to close distance, and the man was on the floor with his arm at an angle that wasn't a natural angle and making sounds that confirmed it wasn't comfortable before the window was halfway open. She crouched down in front of him. He was breathing hard, face against the rug, Baek's knee in his back. "Who sent you?" she said. He said nothing. "I know it's Park," she said. "I know about the documents and Sang-woo and the operation. I'm not asking who's in charge. I'm asking where the rest of your team is." Still nothing. She looked up at Baek. "Check the East Wing entry points. All of them. Right now." He went. She looked back at the man on the floor. "You had one job tonight. Plant the transmitter. Which means there's someone outside waiting to see if you get clear. Which means they're watching this building right now." She stood up, took the man's phone from where it had fallen near the desk. Locked screen. She set it in her pocket and straightened and went back to the main corridor and took the phone from her jacket, Tae-jin's clean line, and said to the voice that was still there, "There was a man inside, East Study. He's contained, but there's an external team. Can your people see them?" "One vehicle," the voice said immediately. "Black sedan parked facing the garden wall. 2 people inside. They've been there 11 minutes. "Are they armed?" "Assumed yes." "They're waiting for a signal from the man inside. When it doesn't come, they'll either move or they'll call for backup." She thought fast. "How long before your people can make them move without a confrontation?" "I don't understand. I need them to leave," she said. "Not get arrested, not get confronted. I need them to decide to leave on their own because something tells them the operation is blown and staying is a liability. Can you create that impression?" A pause. Then something that might have been respect in the voice or just adjustment. "Give me 4 minutes." She used the 4 minutes to go back to the East Wing and check Min-jun. Still in the room, still against the headboard, still with the phone in his hand, and he looked at her face when she came in and said, "Okay?" And she said, "So far," and left. Ji-yeon was in the passage. "The household staff," Ji-yeon said quietly. "2 of the night staff aren't responding to the internal check." Zuri stopped. "Which 2? "Kim and Park, Jiet, the overnight kitchen staff." She thought about the kitchen, the service entrance, the way the security coverage shifted when Tae-jin left the property. Where is Myung-ja's secondary location? The apartment in Mapo, she left at 9. Call the people with her. Tell them to stay put and let no one in unless it's a face they've known for more than 5 years. Use those exact words. She was moving back toward the main floor when her phone, her own phone, not the clean line, rang. Tae-jin. She answered before the second ring. "Are you safe?" "Yes." His voice was compressed in the way of a man in a car moving fast. "Sang-woo is real. I have him. I have everything." A pause. "The house." "Being managed," she said. "1 man inside contained. External team is being handled. 2 missing staff members I'm still locating." Silence. Not long, maybe 3 seconds, but she felt the weight of it. "Zuri," he said. "Drive faster," she said. "Min-jun is fine. Drive faster." She hung up. The voice on the clean line spoke in her pocket. "The sedan is moving. They're heading north." She breathed for the first time in what felt like 10 minutes. "Thank you." "There's something else," the voice said, and his tone had changed, flattened into the register of someone delivering information they didn't want to deliver. "We found your 2 missing staff. They're in the service corridor, zip-tied, alive, which means whoever put them there is still inside the building." Her stomach dropped. She turned around slowly. The corridor behind her was empty. The house was quiet in the managed way that houses were quiet when something was in them that shouldn't be. She thought about the transmitter, about a one-job assignment, about the way operations were layered when someone was genuinely careful. You sent the man with the transmitter knowing he might be caught, because his job wasn't just to plant the device. His job was to draw attention, to be the thing that got found, while the actual operation happened in the part of the house that attention had moved away from. She was in the main corridor. Min-jun was in the east wing. She ran. She hit the east wing door at full speed, and it was locked from the inside, which was right. That was right. Beck was supposed to lock it, but Beck had gone to check the entry points, and the door was locked from the inside, which meant someone had locked it after Beck left. And before she got back, and she was already hitting it with her shoulder when Ji-yeon's voice came through the servants' passage panel, tight and high, with controlled fear. "There's a man in there. He came through the window on the garden side. He has Min-jun." She stopped, pressed her back against the wall, breathed. "One man," she said. "One that I can see." "Is Min-jun hurt?" "No, he's... The man has his arm. He's talking. I can hear it." "What's he saying?" Ji-yeon's voice dropped further. "He's on a phone. He's saying the asset is secure. He's waiting for instruction." Asset. She felt the word like something physical. She looked at the locked door. Heavy wood, solid frame. She couldn't go through it without making noise that would telegraph everything. She looked at the passage panel. Too narrow and too slow. She looked at the window at the end of the corridor, the one that faced the garden, the same side the man had come through. She went to the window, opened it. Cold air came in, and she leaned out and looked at the garden wall and the east wing windows running parallel to her position. 3 windows down. The one at the end, the garden-facing one, was dark. The one before it had light. She was outside before she'd fully decided to be. The garden flagstones were cold through her socks. She'd lost her shoes somewhere in the last 20 minutes and hadn't noticed. And she moved along the building's exterior wall with her back to the stone and the cold coming through everything. She reached the lit window and stopped beside it and listened. She could hear him, speaking Korean in the flat effect of someone reporting. She caught pieces. The building was clear. The primary team had withdrawn. He was holding, waiting for the vehicle to come around. Vehicle. Coming around. She had maybe 4 minutes before a car came through the service entrance, and whatever was going to happen to Min-jun started its next phase. She looked through the glass. The man had his back mostly to her. He was standing between the bed and the door, holding Min-jun's arm at the elbow, phone in his other hand at his ear. Min-jun was standing very still with the specific stillness of a boy who was frightened and was managing it by not moving at all, which was exactly the right instinct, and which meant that whatever she did next had a window of maybe 2 seconds before the man reacted. She looked at the window latch. Simple mechanism, interior operated. She couldn't open it from outside. She looked at the glass. She looked at her elbow. She thought about what Tae-jin had said. "I need to know if you are going to stay." And about what she'd answered, and about the chain of choices that ran from her mother's walk-in cooler to this garden wall in Seoul at midnight with the cold turning her fingers stiff. She hit the glass. It wasn't clean. It never was in reality, nothing like the movies where a single strike made it disappear. She hit it twice, and the second time it gave, and she was through the frame and into the room with her forearm opened up along the inside and the blood coming, and none of that mattered because the man had dropped the phone and turned, and Min-jun had moved, had pulled his arm free in the half-second of the man's distraction, and was across the room against the far wall. The man came at her. He was bigger than her and trained in a way she wasn't, and she knew this with her body in the first 2 seconds of contact. The weight of him. The way he moved, the specific technique of someone who'd done this before. He caught her left arm and she went sideways into the wall, and the impact rattled through her shoulder and she tasted something metallic and thought very clearly, "Don't go down." She didn't go down. She drove her knee up, and he shifted to absorb it, and she got her back off the wall and put her elbow into his face. Not clean, caught his cheekbone. And he stepped back, and she stepped into the space and hit him again, this time with the heel of her hand. And he went back a step further, and his heel caught the edge of the bed frame, and he was off balance for 1 critical second. Min-jun hit him from behind with the desk lamp. It was heavy, a solid brass base, the kind that had some weight to it, and Min-jun swung it with both hands, and all the 15 years of compressed terror and grief, and the specific fury of a boy who had spent his whole life watching people try to use him, and it caught the man across the back of the shoulder and dropped him to one knee. Zuri stepped forward and put her full weight behind the desk chair into the back of his head, and he went down. The room was very loud in her ears with the sound of her own breathing. She stood there for one full second, with her chest heaving and the blood running down her forearm from where the glass had opened it, and looked at the man on the floor. Then she looked at Min-jun. He was standing with the lamp still in his hands, and he was shaking, full body trembling, the kind that came after, when the adrenaline found the fear underneath it. His face was very young right now, stripped of the armor entirely. Just a 15-year-old boy who had swung a lamp in a dark room and was standing in the aftermath of it. She crossed to him. She took the lamp out of his hands gently and set it on the desk, and she put both hands on his face, her cut arm leaving a red print on his jaw that she'd think about later, and made him look at her. "You okay?" she said. He nodded, couldn't speak yet. "You did right," she said. "You hear me? You did exactly right." He nodded again. His eyes were wet, and he was not crying, and he was not going to cry, and she understood that and didn't say anything about it. The east wing door opened. Baek and Choi came through it with the specific energy of men who were 30 seconds late and knew it and were reassessing everything about the last 30 minutes. "He needs to be secured," she said, indicating the man on the floor. "And somebody find the vehicle that's coming through the service entrance. It needs to not come through the service entrance." They moved. She went to the window, the broken one, her exit and entry point, and looked out at the garden and the wall and the street beyond it, and breathed the cold air, and felt her forearm throb with a steady insistence that was going to get louder. Her phone rang. Tae-jin. "I'm at the gate," he said. "Come in through the main," she said. "Service is compromised." A pause. "Everyone's fine. Min-jun is fine." The silence on the line lasted 3 seconds. "I'll be there in 1 minute," he said. She lowered the phone and pressed her back against the wall beside the broken window, and let herself have 30 seconds that belonged to no one else. Not the situation, not Min-jun, not the man on the floor, not the operation converging on its conclusion. 30 seconds of just standing in the cold with the blood on her arm, and the sound of Seoul moving past the wall, and the specific knowledge of what the night had cost, and what it had given and what it meant that she was still here to feel the difference. The 30 seconds ended. She straightened. She went back to Min-jun, who was sitting on the edge of the bed now, still shaking but slower, the tremors working their way out through his hands. She sat beside him, not close enough to crowd, close enough to be there. "Your father's at the gate," she said. He exhaled. A long, ragged, real sound, the kind his body had been holding since she'd come through the window. "He got what he went for," Min-jun said. "Yes." "Sang-woo came through," she said. He was quiet for a moment. His hands had mostly stopped. He was looking at the floor with his father's specific quality of interior processing, the face that went inward when the outside became too much. "The woman who came through the window," he said, without looking up. She waited. "She's going to need to get that arm looked at," he said. She looked down at her forearm. The cut was still bleeding, slower now, a dark line from elbow to mid-forearm where the glass had tracked. "Yeah," she said. "She probably is." He looked up at her then, and his face had the particular openness of a moment right after something real has happened, before the armor came back, before the presentation of normalcy reassembled itself. His eyes were his father's eyes, but also his own, 15 years of their own specific grief and resilience. And what was in them right now was not quite what had been in them 6 weeks ago when she'd first sat across a dinner table from him. The front door of this house opened. She heard Tae-jin's steps in the main corridor. She knew his steps now, the particular rhythm of them, and then moving fast toward the east wing. He came through the door. He took in the room in the way he took in everything. The man on the floor, Baek and Choi, the broken window, the blood on Zuri's arm, in one sweeping assessment that reorganized itself when it reached Min-jun sitting on the bed, and something happened in his face that she'd only seen once before, briefly, in a doorway 3 weeks ago. The instrument was gone. He crossed to his son and put his hand on the back of Min-jun's head, and Min-jun leaned into it with the ease of a boy who had been needing exactly that for approximately 6 weeks, and was only now allowing it. And Tae-jin's eyes went to Zuri over the boy's shoulder. She held the look. There was blood on her arm and glass in her hair, and she was standing in a room that smelled like adrenaline and old wood. And behind his eyes was everything the night had been: Sang-woo and Park, and the files, and the drive-through Seoul, and the minute he'd been on the wrong side of a gate while his son and the woman who had chosen to stay were inside. And none of it was contained in a way that the instrument could manage right now. He said her name. Just that. She said, "We're not done yet." Because Park Sung-ho was still in his house in the hills above the city, and the files Sang-woo had handed over were sitting in a bag in Tae-jin's car, and the document Marcus had signed was still a live mechanism in Park's lawyer's hands, and everything that had been built against the Kang family was still standing and waiting for the morning to find. The files Sang-woo had delivered were in a bag on the kitchen table at 4 in the morning, and they were everything. Tae-jin had spread them across the surface in the particular organized way he organized things under pressure. Not neat, but functional, the layout of a man who needed to see the full shape of something before he could move against it. Zuri sat across from him with her arm wrapped in gauze that Jiyeon had done properly, tight and clean. And she looked at the documents and understood within the first 20 minutes that what Park Sung-ho had built was not the work of a man acting on opportunism. It was the work of a man who had been planning this for a long time and who had been patient about it in a way that was almost admirable if you set aside what it had been aimed at. 8 years. The earliest document in the file was dated 8 years ago. A financial communication between Park and a network of Korean business interests in Los Angeles that laid the groundwork for what eventually became the mechanism to absorb the Kang organization's legitimate holdings. Park had watched Tae-jin's father age, had watched Tae-jin take over, had assessed the transition and identified the structural vulnerabilities, the dependence on Sang-woo's internal knowledge, the exposure of the American operation, the fact that Tae-jin had a child, and therefore something that could be used, and had begun building quietly, from a position of apparent partnership, the apparatus to dismantle everything. Sang-woo was sitting in a chair in the corner of the kitchen. He had come in with Tae-jin at the gate and had walked through the house with the specific quality of a man walking through a place he'd expected never to see again. And now he sat with his hands on his knees and his face doing nothing except existing, which was its own kind of expression. He was 61 and looked at tonight in a way that the dinner table version of him hadn't. The armor was gone. What was underneath it was a man who had been carrying something for 6 years that had made him old from the inside. Tae-jin had not spoken to him directly since they came in. He'd spoken around him, to Zuri, to Baek, to the voice on the clean line who was now identified as Song, the operations deputy who had come to the house and was sitting at the table working through the legal implications of the documents with the focus of a man who ran on crisis. Around Sang-woo there was a space that nobody filled, a perimeter that everyone in the room observed without being told to. It was Zuri who broke it. She set down the document she was reading and looked at him directly. "The attack 6 years ago," she said. "The one that killed Song Yi. Did you know it was going to be that bad?" The room shifted. Song stopped typing. Tae-jin didn't look up from the papers, but she felt the change in the quality of his stillness. Sang-woo looked at her. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had answered this question 10,000 times in the dark and was answering it now in the light for the first time. "I knew about the route," he said. "I knew the timing. I didn't know—" He stopped, breathed. "I was told it was a warning, a show of force to make Tae-jin step back from the Busan expansion. I was told no one would be seriously hurt." "But you didn't verify that," she said. "No. And when it went wrong?" He looked at his hands. "I told myself I hadn't known. I repeated that to myself for 6 years until it became the thing I believed instead of what I knew." He looked up. "That's not a defense. I'm not offering it as one." The kitchen was very quiet. Tae-jin set down the document he was holding. He looked at Sang-woo for a long moment. The full weight of it, nothing managed or contained, just a man looking at another man across 6 years of a lie, and all the things that had grown out of it. "Why did you come back?" Tae-jin said. His voice was not loud. It was the quietest she'd ever heard it, which made it the most dangerous thing in the room. "Because Park was going to have me killed," Sang-woo said. "And because—" He stopped again, pressed his lips together. "Because Min-jun is 16 years old and doesn't have a mother, and I put my hands on him at his mother's funeral." His voice broke on the last part just slightly, a crack in old stone. I couldn't let Park use him. I couldn't let myself be the instrument of that a second time. No one spoke. Tae-jin stood up. He pushed back from the table and walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room and his hands at his sides. And she watched him from across the table and thought about everything the night had cost and what it was going to cost still before it was finished. After a long moment, he turned back. "You'll give a full deposition," he said. "Everything you know about Park's network, every name, every transaction, every communication, you give it to Song and you give it completely." Sang-woo nodded. "And then you're done," Tae-jin said. "Whatever comes after that, legally, personally, is not something I control and not something I'm going to manage for you. You understand?" "Yes," Sang-woo said. "Good." He went back to the table, picked up the document. "Then let's finish this." The call to Park Sung-ho happened at 6:15 in the morning. Tae-jin made it from the study, with Song beside him, and a recording running and Zuri in the chair by the window that she'd come to think of as her chair in this room. She'd asked to be there. He hadn't argued. Park answered on the second ring, which told her he hadn't slept either, that he'd been waiting for his team to report the operation complete, had been waiting through the night for a call that confirmed the leverage was secured, and was now receiving instead the voice of a man who was not supposed to be in a position to make calls. There was a pause after Tae-jin said his name. 2 full seconds. In those 2 seconds, she heard Park recalibrate, heard it in the texture of his silence, the specific quality of a man processing a failure in real time and deciding how to present himself on the other side of it. "Tae-jin," Park said, "Dits" in Korean. Ji Yeon, seated to Zuri's right, murmured the translation low and steady. "I've been trying to reach you." "I know," Tae-jin said. "There was an incident last night at your property. I heard this morning from Park." Just the name. A full stop. Silence. "I have the files," Tae-jin said. "Sang-woo gave me everything. 8 years of communications, financial transfers, operational planning, the complete record of what you built and how you built it and who helped you build it." A pause. "I also have 3 of your people in custody, all of whom have been cooperative." The silence on Park's end lasted 4 seconds. She counted them. "I think we should meet," Park said. His voice had changed. The warmth was gone. The practiced social ease of a man who ran a room, and what was underneath it was older and harder and genuinely dangerous. "The situation is more complex than it appears from where you're standing." "I know exactly how complex it is," Tae-jin said. "That's why I'm calling instead of doing what I could do." He let that sit for 1 beat. "I want you in my lawyer's office at 10 this morning. You'll bring your own counsel. You'll come with the documents you have on my wife's brother, and you'll come prepared to discuss the terms of a full dissolution of your business relationship with my organization." That's a significant... "If you're not there at 10, Tae-jin said, "the files go to the Financial Crimes Unit at the prosecutor's office. The communications go to the 3 journalists I've already identified who have been building cases on the political network you're connected to. And Sang-woo goes on record about everything including the 2019 attack." A pause. "Your family's name will be unrecognizable inside a year." Another silence. Longer. 10 o'clock, Park said. Tae-jin ended the call. She let out the breath she'd been holding since the call connected. Song was already on his own phone, moving fast. She looked at Tae-jin, who was sitting very still with the phone on the desk in front of him, and his hands flat on either side of it. "He'll come," she said. "Yes." He looked up. "He'll come because he doesn't have a choice. And he'll arrive with a plan, and the plan will involve trying to find a version of this that he can survive." "And what version can he survive?" Tae-jin looked at the desk. "A limited one," he said. "He signs over the leverage. He dissolves the network he built against us. He pulls his people out of the Los Angeles operation, and he absorbs the financial loss of the restructuring." A pause. "He keeps his company. He keeps his family's name. And he spends the rest of his life knowing I could undo all of that whenever I chose to." She thought about this. "That's not justice." "No," he said. "It's not." "Is it enough?" He looked at her. "It keeps Min-jun safe. It keeps you safe. It ends the operational threat." He paused. I've been in this world long enough to know that justice and safety are not always available simultaneously, and when they aren't, I choose safety. She sat with this, turned it, found the edges of it. She thought about Song Yi and what Sang Woo had carried and what Park's patience had cost over 8 years, and she thought about whether there was a version of this that felt clean. There wasn't. She understood that now in a way she hadn't 6 weeks ago. That most of what happened in the world that mattered happened in the absence of clean, and the people who waited for clean spent their whole lives waiting. Okay, she said. Us. Park came at 10. He came with 2 lawyers and the specific composure of a man who had spent 60 years building a face for difficult rooms and intended to use it until the end. He sat across the conference table from Taijin and Song and their legal team, and he looked at Zuri, who was seated at the far end of the table, not as a participant in the legal discussion, but as a presence, deliberate and visible, with the eyes of a man revising his assessment of several decisions he'd made. She looked back at him and said nothing. The meeting lasted 4 hours. She was not in the room for all of it. There were portions that were legal and financial and required people whose expertise she didn't have. She sat in the waiting area outside and drank bad coffee and thought about Marcus and about her mother and about the specific texture of her life before Chicago and this and what it meant that she could no longer access that texture with any real clarity. The person she'd been in that restaurant 6 weeks ago, writing down Mrs. Calloway's grits order, watching SUVs idle at the curb, was not someone she could inhabit anymore. Not because that person had been destroyed, because she'd been built on. Her phone rang at 11:40. Marcus. She answered. The lawyer called, he said. Yoon. He said the documents I signed are being... He used a lot of legal language. I didn't understand all of it, but he said they're being neutralized. Is that right? Yes, she said. How? Park is signing something that makes what you signed irrelevant. The liability chain is being broken. A long pause. Zuri. Marcus. I'm sorry, he said. I know I keep... Stop. She said it quietly, not harshly. I know you're sorry. You're always sorry. That's not the question anymore. He was quiet. The question is what you do next, she said. Yoon is going to call you again this week. He's going to recommend a financial counselor, and he's going to recommend a specific kind of support program, not because I asked him to, but because it's part of what we worked out, and you agreed to it when you agreed to cooperate. She paused. I need you to take both calls seriously. Yeah, he said. Not yeah, like you're agreeing to get off the phone with me. Yeah, like you mean it. A longer pause. She could hear him breathing, could hear the specific weight of a man who was sitting with who he was and what it had cost, and whether he had enough to change it. Yeah, he said again, and this time it had different weight. Not certainty. She wasn't asking for certainty. She'd stopped asking for certainty from Marcus a long time ago. But it had the weight of a man who was trying, and for now that was what she had to work with. Good, she said. I'll call Mama this weekend. She hung up and sat with the bad coffee in the waiting room in the specific quiet of an ending that didn't feel like an ending yet, because too many things were still in motion. The meeting concluded at 2 in the afternoon. Park left with his lawyers in the particular silence of a man who had swallowed something that would sit in him for the rest of his life. She watched him walk to his car from the window of the conference room and thought about what Tae-jin had said, that he would spend the rest of his life knowing. She thought about whether that was sufficient and arrived at the same answer she'd arrived at in the waiting room. Not clean, but done. Song handled the remaining operational pieces over the following week. The people in the Los Angeles network who needed to be disconnected. The financial restructuring that protected the Kang organization's legitimate holdings. The quiet communications to the political relationships that had been compromised by Park's involvement. She watched it from the edges and understood more of it than she'd understood a month ago, which was its own kind of measure of how much had changed. Sang-woo gave his deposition over 3 days. Full, detailed, unsparing. When it was done, he left Seoul on a flight to somewhere that Song had arranged and didn't say goodbye to anyone, which she thought was probably correct. There was no version of that goodbye that wasn't too heavy to carry. She heard through Ji Yeon 2 weeks later that he'd gone to Jeju, that he was living simply and quietly and was apparently helping at a small community farm which was an ending so unassuming for a man of his history that it almost circled back to being strange. She thought about it once and then put it away in the category of things that were finished. Getuasin. 3 months passed, not quietly. The Kong organization's restructuring was loud in ways that weren't visible to the outside. That required Taejin's attention at hours that left him pale and precise, in a way that she recognized as a man burning through reserves. She fed him when he forgot to eat. She sat with him at midnight, when the work had a quality that required another presence in the room, even if that presence said nothing. She learned the specific geography of his exhaustion, when it was the productive kind, and when it was the kind that needed to be interrupted, and she managed it without announcement because that was what the situation required, and because she'd been doing versions of this management her whole life, first for her mother's restaurant, then for Marcus, now here, and there was a difference this time that she only fully understood gradually. This time she wasn't doing it alone. He noticed things too, the way she got quiet when she was working through something difficult and needed space. The specific study pattern that meant she was preparing for an exam and should not be interrupted between 7 and 10 in the morning. The Wednesday afternoon calls to her mother that she made from the garden regardless of weather, standing in the cold with her phone pressed to her ear, laughing at things Denise Bennett said. Her whole body different during those 20 minutes in a way that the rest of the week wasn't. He asked about her mother once, genuinely asked, not as conversation, but sitting in the kitchen late with the quality of attention she'd learned to trust as real. She told him about the restaurant, about what it had been to grow up in it, what it had meant to her grandmother and then her mother, what she'd felt when she watched the SUVs idle at the curb outside it, and thought she was watching the last thing her family had lose its last protection. He listened, the way he listened when something mattered, completely, without filling the space, without the slight administrative quality that conversations had when someone was partly somewhere else. When she finished, he said, "Your mother built something that lasted." She thought about this. "Yeah," she said, "she did." "That's not nothing," he said. "Most things don't." She looked at him across the kitchen island and thought about contracts and debts, and the particular impossibility of predicting what a transaction became when two people were inside it long enough. The exam was in April. Medical school at Yonsei was structured differently than her American nursing program had been. More rigorous in certain ways, more compressed, with a clinical component that required her to be at the hospital 3 days a week, in addition to her coursework. She'd adapted to it with the same fury she adapted to everything, which meant that by April she was exhausted in a deep and specific way that she recognized as productive, the kind that meant something was being built. Minjun came to the exam. She hadn't known he was going to. He hadn't said anything, had been his usual self in the days before, which meant slightly warmer than he'd been at the beginning, but still operating with the controlled coolness of a teenager who'd decided that overt demonstrations of feeling were not his medium. He was just there when she came out of the building, standing on the steps with his hands in his jacket pockets and his collar up against the spring wind. She stopped when she saw him. "How'd it go?" he said. "I think okay," she said. "Ask me in 2 weeks when the results come." He nodded, fell in to step beside her as she came down the stairs. They walked for a moment without talking, which was something they'd gotten good at together. The particular ease of two people who didn't need to fill every space. "Dad's making dinner tonight," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Your father is cooking. He said he wanted to." A pause. "He's been watching videos, Korean, some American. He found a recipe for..." Minjun's mouth did something that was almost a smile. "He found a recipe for something called smothered pork chops." She stopped walking. Minjun stopped too. He looked at her sideways, and the almost smile was more present now, the armor genuinely down for this particular moment. "Your grandmother used to make that," he said. "Apparently you mentioned it once. He found a Chicago soul food recipe." Another pause. "I'm not telling you it's going to be good. I'm just telling you he's been at it since noon." She stood on the steps of Yonsei University in the April wind with her exam folder under her arm and felt something move through her that didn't have a clean name. Not happiness exactly, though it lived near happiness, and not grief, though it touched grief at the edges. Something that had the texture of a life being genuinely lived rather than endured, which was a distinction she'd forgotten existed somewhere in the years of managing everything alone. "We should get home then," she said. He nodded, very seriously. "Probably." They walked to the car together, and the spring was cold still but less sharp than it had been, the particular quality of a season turning. Myung-ja came back from Busan in May. She came the way she always came, without warning, with the proprietary ease of a woman who considered the Hanam house an extension of herself regardless of who technically lived in it. But something was different this time. Zuri felt it in the first hour, a slight recalibration in the older woman's manner, not warmth exactly, not the dramatic revision of a changed heart, but something more honest than that, an acknowledgement that things had happened that she hadn't been present for and that the accounting of them had changed what she understood. She didn't say this directly. She wouldn't. That wasn't the medium she operated in. She said it in the way she began asking Zuri in the mornings when they were both early risers who ended up in the same part of the house before the household woke up, small questions. About the medical school program, about the charitable foundation that Zuri had begun sketching out, an idea she'd mentioned to Tae-jin once, late, about free clinics for immigrant communities in Seoul. The people who fell through the cracks of the city's systems, the way she could have fallen through cracks if she'd arrived here without the specific circumstances that had caught her. Tae-jin had listened to the idea with the particular attention he gave things that interested him, and then had said, "Tell me the numbers, and we'll build it." She'd spent 2 months on the numbers. She showed them to Myung-ja one morning in the sitting room, not because she needed her approval, but because the older woman asked, and because Zuri had come to understand, slowly, that Myung-ja's questions were a form of respect that she was still learning how to give. Myung-ja looked at the plans with her reading glasses on, and her tea cooling beside her. She was quiet for a long time. When she looked up, she said in Korean, slowly enough for Zuri to follow without Ji-yeon, "This will help many people who need to be helped." "That's the intention," Zuri said in Korean. The older woman looked at her. "Your Korean is good now," she said. "Getting there." Myung-ja picked up her tea. "My husband built his business on helping people who had no other options," she said. "Not always in the right ways, but that was where it started." She looked at the plans again. Tae-jin never had the heart for the parts of it that his father was comfortable with. He carried those parts anyway because he was built that way, because he understood duty in a specific way that my husband built into him. A pause. "You are building something that the duty does not require, that is different." She put down the plans and picked up her tea and looked at the garden, and the conversation was apparently finished, which was the Myung-ja way of things, and Zuri had learned to read completions. But sitting there in the morning light with the older woman who had walked into her life as an obstacle and had become something more complicated than that, she thought about what had just been said, and held it carefully because it was the kind of thing that didn't repeat and deserved to be kept properly. On an evening in October, exactly 1 year after the morning the first black SUV had rolled past her mother's restaurant window, Tae-jin asked her to walk in the garden with him. The garden in October was different from when she'd arrived. The trees had turned and the air had the same blade in it that Seoul's autumn carried, and the mountains were visible to the north in the particular evening clarity that came before the temperature fully dropped. They walked the perimeter path that she'd walked every morning for a year, the stones familiar under her feet in a way that the world outside the wall still wasn't entirely, though it was more familiar than it had been. He didn't speak for the first part of the walk. He walked the way he walked, measured, present, hands in his pockets, and she walked beside him, and the silence was the kind they'd gotten good at. He stopped at the bench near the far wall, the one under the old ginkgo tree that dropped its leaves in November in a color that was almost aggressively yellow. He sat down and she sat beside him, and he looked at the mountains for a while. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "I want to ask you to stay." He paused. "Not the contract, not the arrangement. I want to ask you, separately from all of that, whether you want to stay." She looked at the mountains, too, at the darkening sky above them, at the city spread between here and there, 10 million lives moving through their October evening. "The contract ends in January," she said. "Yes. And if I said I wanted to go?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then I would make sure everything was arranged properly. Your degree, your foundation plans, whatever you needed to take with you. A pause. Minjun would survive it. He survived harder things. Another pause, shorter. I would survive it. The last part came out differently from the others. More weight, more cost visible in it. She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains with the particular quality of a man who had asked the thing he needed to ask, and was now waiting in the specific dignity of someone who had prepared himself for either answer. She thought about the walk-in cooler in Chicago, about the table in the restaurant and the leather folder and a man she'd never met offering her an impossible bargain. She thought about all the things she hadn't chosen and all the things she had, and the specific way that the line between those two categories had shifted over the course of a year until it was almost impossible to locate. I'm already staying, she said. He turned and looked at her. I made that decision a while ago, she said. I just didn't say it out loud because there wasn't a right moment, and then there were too many other things happening. She held his gaze. I'm not staying because of the contract. I'm not staying because of what it would cost to leave. I'm staying because this is where I am now. This is... She paused, finding the right word, and then finding it. This is mine. He looked at her for a long time. The controlled face was doing what it did when the instrument was still present, but something had moved behind it that the instrument couldn't fully manage. There's something I want to say, he said. She waited. When you came here, he said, you came because you had no other choice. And I told myself the arrangement was practical, that I had assessed the situation and identified a functional solution. He looked down at his hands, the way he looked at his hands when something was being said that he'd been working up to for a while. That was true. And it was also not the whole truth. She said nothing. I told you, that first night in the kitchen, that I chose you because you were outside this world, because you had your own reasons. That was true. He looked up. I also chose you because when you sat across that table in Chicago and I told you what I was offering, when I expected fear or calculation or the specific negotiation of someone managing a very bad situation, you looked at me. He paused. You just looked at me, directly, like you were deciding who I was independent of everything I'd just said. Another pause. I hadn't been looked at that way in a very long time. The garden was very quiet. The city past the wall was its usual enormous self. She reached over and put her hand on top of his, the way she'd put it on the car seat the night of Park's event. Not intertwined, just placed, the simple weight of a hand. He turned his over and held it. They sat there until the temperature made sitting outside impractical, which took a while because neither of them moved first. And the ginkgo tree dropped two of its yellow leaves onto the path in front of them in the light wind, and the mountains held their shape against the darkening sky the way mountains did, patient and indifferent and present. The way things were that had been there long before any particular human story and would be there after, carrying none of the weight and all of the witness. When they finally went inside, the lights in the kitchen were on, and Min-jun was at the counter eating leftovers directly from the container the way 16-year-old boys ate leftovers. And he looked up when they came in and looked at their joined hands with the specific expression of a boy pretending not to have noticed something he had clearly noticed. He looked back at the container. There's more in the refrigerator, he said, to no one in particular. She let go of Tae-jin's hand to get 3 bowls from the cabinet, and the kitchen was warm and the city was dark and loud outside. And somewhere in Chicago, her mother was closing the restaurant for the evening and turning off the lights over the counter and going home through the October cold. And Zuri was here, in Seoul, at a kitchen counter, in the life that had been built out of the worst morning she'd ever lived through. She set the 3 bowls on the counter. Min-jun moved over without being asked to make room. She sat down beside him and served the food, and the 3 of them ate in the kitchen with the particular ease of people who had been through something together that didn't require narration. The story carried in the way they passed containers and didn't feel the need to explain the silences. And outside the wall, the city kept moving through its 10 million lives, indifferent and enormous, and in this moment, just for this moment, completely beside the point.